All right, guys, talking about key issue 4 of chapter 3 today, why do migrants face obstacles? The first thing that we're going to look at is what's called an intervening obstacle. This is basically anything that prevents someone from being able to migrate. Now, typically this is going to be environmental, just simply because you have to travel such a long distance. Most people aren't capable of doing it. However, due to the technological revolution, industrial revolution, people are able to do it more often because things like boats and things like cars and such are more readily available today. So now the problem that most of them face is political. That is, countries that people typically want to immigrate to don't want to take a whole lot of immigrants, and so they institute what's called quota laws. All right, and they've changed a lot over the years. We're looking specifically at the United States quota laws. In 1924, they had one that was pretty nefarious. It was basically you allowed 2% of whatever population that country already had in the United States to come in. So, for example, if you had 100,000 people from China, then you could allow 2,000 in that year. This basically just allowed a bunch of Western Europeans and not many other people, because Western Europeans had been able to come in for forever, and so their numbers were very, very high in the United States. In 1965, they changed it to where it was based on hemispheres. Obviously, 1965, you're going to start seeing a lot more people coming from Latin America, and so they tried to curve that as much as they could. So 170,000 were allowed from the Eastern Hemisphere, or basically not Latin America, and only 120,000 were allowed from the Western Hemisphere. Then a global quota of 290,000 was set. So you're thinking, oh, okay, this is good. We're not going to prevent people from a certain hemisphere from being able to come into the country. However, there was a maximum of 20,000 people per year per country. And then in 1990, the global quota was raised to 700,000 because obviously our population was growing, and that was something that was going to need to happen. So when they do that, though, they look specifically at certain situations, and so these are the three things that they look at the most, and it's not necessarily in this order, because skilled workers are going to get the most love from immigration, because skilled workers are basically the people who can do things technologically, or basically anything that requires a skill, and so they would have them come over before they would have somebody else come over. Then they look at family reunification. So if a father had come over legally, or a mother had come over legally, and then they bring their entire family over. And then diversity. It looks good to have as many people from as many places as you can if we're going to still call America a melting pot. And so to have immigrants come from countries that aren't typically coming, that's something that we want. Then we talked about brain drain a little bit already. When you have a country that only likes to take skilled workers, then skilled workers want to leave their level 2 and level 3 countries and come to the United States or Europe. And so places like India say that we contribute to brain drain because we're taking all of their skilled workers. Then there's what's called chain migration. Chain migration is basically like if your cousin came to the United States, or your cousin went to Australia or whatever, and then you're like, oh man, I hear my cousin's doing a really good job over there, I should probably go over there. And then so you go over there, and then the rest of your family goes over there, and it's just a chain. So that's chain migration. When we look at characteristics of unauthorized immigrants in the United States, the source country is almost always, not almost always, but very, very often going to be from Latin America, but more specifically Mexico. Children are relatively common. They represent about 1 million of the 11.2 million unauthorized immigrants, and then 4.5 million are born in the United States, making them citizens of the United States. And then the interesting thing here is the years in the United States has actually changed. In 2000, about 32% of unauthorized immigrants had been in the United States for less than 5 years. However, that number is pretty much flipped, and now only 15% of immigrants have been in the unauthorized immigrants have been in the United States for less than 5 years. So they're staying longer. Then we look at the Mexico's border with the United States, and this is another one that's really, really interesting. Is you guys probably think you understand the border controversy with Mexico and the United States, but the same thing is happening with Mexico and Guatemala. Mexico is basically currently urging the United States to try to understand the plight of the immigrants, and they want them to be able to go into the United States and seek a better life. They're basically leaving a level 3 country for a level 4 country. But then you see the same thing to their southern border with Guatemala. And Guatemala is sending a lot of unauthorized immigrants into Mexico, and Mexico is advocating stronger border control. And so it's one of those things where now Guatemala is a stage 2 country, so you've got a stage 2 people leaving stage 2 going into stage 3, and stage 3 people leaving Mexico and going into stage 4 in the United States. And so it's sort of just interesting to see what's happening with the shoe on the other foot. These are the varying levels of immigration patrol, and you can see why unauthorized immigration is so high, because some of these places are very, very difficult. If you look right here, it's very, very difficult to get into the United States. However, if you look right here, probably not as hard. All right, so then we start looking at the characteristics of the immigrants. It used to be that they were predominantly male, more than likely primarily because they were the ones that thought that they could get jobs. However, as the United States has developed, women have been getting more and more jobs, and we'll get into like equal pay and all that kind of stuff when we get to development. But for the most part, women are getting more and more jobs now, and so now 55% of immigrants are female. And so that's kind of interesting. When you look at the age, you're going to see that a majority of them are like young people. And then you look at the way like immigration concerns in the United States. Okay, Border Patrol, like workplaces. Some people are still making the argument that they're like having jobs taken from them by immigrants. Civil rights problems. Americans favor letting law enforcement officials stop and verify the legal status of anyone they suspect of being an unauthorized immigrant. But that's sort of super illegal because that's basically just profiling. And then local initiatives. Polls show that most Americans believe that enforcement of unauthorized immigration is a federal government responsibility and do not support the use of local law enforcement officials to find unauthorized immigrants. And so, like most people say, you know, that's not really our problem. Let the federal government handle it. Then you look at these three words up here. All right, we've been using the word unauthorized immigrants, and that's the term that's preferred by academic observers. Undocumented immigrant is the term that's preferred by like people who are advocating for more civil rights for the unauthorized immigrants, and then illegal alien is the one that is used by people who typically prefer like stronger law enforcement against these people. Okay, so finally we're going to look at European immigration and European emigration. And basically a majority of the kinds of European immigration used to be like interregional. Okay, so it's still international, but as far as like Europe as a region is concerned, it was interregional because they were moving from one region of Europe to another, whether it was from south to north, north to south, whatever. And as you can see here, there's not a whole lot of method to the madness. It used to be people leaving the south to go to the north because they were industrialized first. Now it's people leaving the north to go to the south because they have better climates. But that's happening a lot less now because immigration between European countries, even with the European Union, has become relatively difficult. And so the way that you see a majority of the population influx now comes from immigration from other countries, stage 3, stage 2 countries. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about when we do our Socratic seminar is, you know, whether or not the immigrants going into Europe should be treated the way that they're being treated. And so the last thing is Europeans as immigrants. And this is basically sort of just looking ironically at the fact that like Europeans don't particularly want people from stage 2 or stage 3 coming into their country, just like Mexico doesn't want people from Guatemala coming into the country, just like, you know, people are just, they don't trust other people. People are stingy and they don't like to share. And so it's funny that Europeans don't want people to come into their countries when Europeans, like throughout history, have represented the largest immigrants in world history. They've had 65 million people move all over the world and basically change world history from its very beginning. And so it's sort of just interesting and ironic that they take that stance.